And today we begin our winter series. We start 2018 by a conversation, 8-week conversation called The Grace Effect. The grace effect. How experiencing God's grace should cause us to desire to be generous in all of life's areas. And so let's begin the conversation here. The conversation here 3 weekends ago. It's just a picture that I took near my house. It was December 14, 15, that beautiful snowfall. You wake up in the morning, you look outside, it looks like a winter wonderland. But that weekend, my son and daughter-in-law were in Chicago and they got nothing. Blue sky, dry pavement. And here in West Michigan, we experienced that snow because of something that is called lake effect. I've always wanted to be a weatherman, so here we go. The concept behind lake effect is that the prevailing breezes are from the west, and so they sweep across Lake Michigan, and while the winds cross Lake Michigan, they pick up moisture, and then when it hits landfall, that moisture gets dumped on us in the form of snow that covers your driveways, your sidewalks, your homes and houses. It's called lake effect. Snow. So work with me for a second here because this is where we're headed, not with lake effect, but with the grace effect. Is it possible for the breeze of God's generosity to move into your life and through your life in a way that it causes generosity to fall on the people around you, in your family, in your church, in your community, and at work? What if the winds of God's generosity were to blow into your life so powerfully that it would spill out of you, dump out of you into the people around you? It's called the grace effect. And today's conversation, we're gonna be beginning this 8-week conversation of our winter series by traveling to a place called Ephesus. Now, little orientation to the Mediterranean world in the first century. Jerusalem over here, this is where the Jesus movement begins. Jerusalem is where Jesus is executed, where he's crucified. It's also where the resurrection takes place. And Jerusalem is where the first nucleus of Jesus followers, where the Jesus movement begins to rapidly grow. In 2 to 3 decades, it spread throughout the Mediterranean rim. Our fall was spent here, Philippi, by seeing the letter that was written to the Philippians. 1st and 2nd Corinthians in your Bible is correspondence written also by the Apostle Paul to people living in the port city of Corinth. And if you open a Bible to the table of contents of the New Testament and you see Ephesians, it is a letter written to Christians, Jesus followers, the Jesus community living there in Ephesus. And so just a couple words about Ephesus. Ephesus was a big deal. In the first century, Ephesus was the 4th largest city in the Roman world. Because it was on the coast of the Aegean Sea, Ephesus was the city that dominated trade for this side of the Aegean. And so you'd have trade roads that come in overland and then ships landing at the harbor of Ephesus. And so in today's terms, it would be like a New York City or like a Hong Kong as far as being a trade center. Just a couple pictures to show you what you would see if you were to travel there today. This is the reconstructed facade of the Celsus Library that was built in the 2nd century. And here on this side, there's a triple arched entryway. That's one of the entrances to the marketplace, the shopping center, the Agora. And it was one of the larger shopping centers, one of the larger marketplaces of the ancient world. It was 100 yards by 100 yards. That's like 2 football fields side by side. And so you've got shops all the way around it, kiosks on the inside. So it's kind of like this town square and shopping center as well. And in the marketplace of Ephesus, I think you could buy anything in the world. Because of the boats that are coming and going and the cargo that's coming and going. I think in the marketplace of Ephesus, you could buy Egyptian jewelry, you could buy spices from the Far East, you could buy the latest fashions from Rome. I mean, if you could buy it and find it, you could find it in the marketplace of Ephesus. Regarding entertainment and the arts, this is a picture of the stadium. You're saying, well, it probably just looks large because of the lens. Take a look at the overhead view and just go, whoa, welcome to the theater of Ephesus. Now, I've had the privilege of traveling to Ephesus on a handful of occasions, and I know that you can sit right up here in the top of the theater, and if someone is down on the stage floor talking in a normal but strong, firm voice, you can hear them all the way to the top. The acoustics are extraordinary still. And so the reason the library, the shopping center, the theater, I guess what I'm saying is this. When Paul writes to believers in Ephesus, it's not some city with a few shacks and 6 goats. It's a major metropolitan area with all of its challenges. New Christians there, they had challenges with families, husbands and wives and kids all trying to get along, challenges with relationships, money challenges. And the Apostle Paul writes to them, and it's just like 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion. This whole Jesus thing is really new. And so he's writing to them to encourage their first steps in their new faith. But something interesting about how Ephesians is constructed. I mean, if you were to find it in the New Testament of your Bible, you would quickly see that it has been divided into 6 chapters. But chapters 1, 2, and 3 do something radically different than chapters 4, 5, and 6. And so just kind of the structure of the book, all of the commands are in chapters 4, 5, and 6. In chapters 4, 5, and 6, the Apostle Paul writes to them and saying, listen, you've got a new script. And God is calling you out of an old story, and he's bringing you into a new story. And so let me give you some guidelines for living out this new script and this story that you're now part of. All the commands are in chapters 4, 5, and 6. Well, what do you find in chapters 1, 2, and 3? In chapters 1, 2, and 3, no commands. He doesn't tell them to do anything. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, all he does in chapters 1, 2, and 3 is this. Remember who you are, remember who you are, remember who you are. Remember how much God loves you. Remember that generosity God expressed for you when he made you as kids, when he came and died for you on the cross. All he does in chapters 1, 2, and 3 is saying, just comprehend the gift that you've been given. It's like he says, I want to let you know that you belong before I tell you how to behave. Before I tell you how to behave, I just want to remind you that you belong. And so the way we're gonna walk through various sections of Paul's letter to the Ephesians today is just this. First, we want to look at the gift that we are given, that is the gift that we receive. And then we'll take a look, secondly, at the gifts that we give. So chapters 1, 2, and 3, the gift we receive. Chapters 4, 5, and 6, the gifts that we give. And my friends, this is huge. In this first conversation, we're going to be reminded that gift receivers are to be transformed into gift givers. And we're talking here not simply about financial generosity, but generosity in all of its forms. The gift of hospitality, the gift of forgiveness when somebody does something thoughtless or stupid that harms us, offering generous words. But when we realize the lavish generosity of God that flows into our lives, there's something about that should unlock and unleash our hearts to pursue generosity in all of its forms. Today's the opening conversation, but through the 8 weeks of this series called The Grace Effect, it is my sincere hope that a revolution of generosity begins among the people of Ada Bible Church, and then that ripples out far from us. What if our gracious God would be so pleased to launch a generosity movement among us? That at the conclusion of this series, there would be people who say, I am now pursuing radical financial generosity, not token generosity, radical generosity, where I actually begin to organize my finances around giving money away. This is a miracle of God in a materialistic culture. There will be individuals say, no, listen, Jeff, I've given faithfully money away for years, but I don't have a generous spirit. My words are unkind and sometimes cruel. And I believe this whole thing about generosity of speech will transform the way I interact with my family and the way I interact at work. There are some of you that will find yourself having absolutely new radar in showing expressions of love to people you don't even know and aren't connected to. It's called hospitality. The biblical principle of hospitality, the word means lover of strangers. And you will have next weekend, our conversation is about hospitality, being a lover of strangers. What does it look like to have gestures of kindness into the lives of people that really aren't in your friend group? Some of you will emerge from this series with brand new radar about loving people who don't have people. Showing expressions of love to people who don't have people. Generosity in all of its forms. May our gracious God be pleased to start a movement of generosity among us as we have these conversations together about the grace effect. And so the first part of the sermon is just about the gift we receive, and then the second part of the sermon is about the gifts that we give. So the first thing you will surmise is that I didn't wrap this. Because anything that I attempt to wrap looks like it was done by a 5-year-old wearing mittens. I am very confident that it must have been a dude that invented the gift bag. Dude, just drop it in and put some paper on top of it, and you're good. So this box, this gift represents the gift that we receive from God when we come to understand and comprehend and accept and receive what Jesus came and gave for us. So this first part is about the gift that we receive. The gift we receive, Ephesians chapter 1, Paul starts with this. This is verses 4 and 5. I mean, it's like all that happens in verses 1 and 2 are kind of like grace and peace to you. As soon as you actually get into the body of the letter, this is right out of the gate. Sentences into the letter. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. Let's read this one together. Ready? In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. In accordance with his pleasure and will. What does that mean? Because he wanted to. But the critical word here is the word adoption. In love, through Jesus and what he did, God makes you his treasured daughters and his cherished sons. It's about adoption. This is massive in our culture. It was different though in their culture. Understand that first century Roman culture was a disposable, throwaway culture when it came to kids. It was common in Roman culture when a baby is born and the baby is brought and it's placed at the father's feet. And if the dad wants the kid, he reaches down and picks it up, claiming it as his own. And if he doesn't, he just turns around and walks away. And he can do that for any reason. Perhaps he wanted a daughter and this was a son. Maybe this is a boy and he wanted a girl. Perhaps he sees some blemish or some imperfection of which he disapproves. He simply turns his back and walks away. And at that point, the infant was exposed to the elements. No, don't kill the child. Let the gods decide. And so you take the baby and just place the baby in the marketplace, perhaps in the town dump, on a hillside somewhere. The child can die of dehydration or hypothermia. But there were individuals that went around listening for the crying of these infants, then to check them out and to determine which ones had the highest probability of growing into strong men and women. And you would take the child home and you would raise the child to later sell as a prostitute or as a slave. There was a doctor, a physician by the name of Sonorus who lived in Ephesus, and he wrote a slender volume called How to Identify an Infant Worth Raising. How do you measure this child, this infant lying there in the garbage heap, to determine whether or not there's a high likelihood that this could grow into a solid investment? How to identify an infant worth raising. Undoubtedly, there were people that had come to faith who were part of the church at Ephesus, who were part of the Jesus community, who had been dumped as kids and that someone else had raised. Undoubtedly, as the letter to the Ephesians was being read, there were people that had been dumped as infants, and they heard those words, "In love, the God of the universe adopted you." Do you know what this means? What this meant for them is that their most defining moment in life wasn't who threw them out, but who took them in. Paul is writing here, once you've come to know Jesus, your most distinguishing feature in life isn't the person who dumped you, abandoned you, and threw you out. Your most defining moment isn't the parent who left you. It's not the parent who neglected you. It's not the fiance who broke up with you. It's not the boyfriend or girlfriend who dumped you. Your most distinguishing definer in life is who took you in. Paul is writing here, he picked you out, he picked you up, he brought you home. Because it gave him such pleasure to do so according to his pleasure and will. This is how Ephesians 1 begins, and all he's saying is, comprehend the gift that you have received. He adopted you. Now, we have lots of friends who have adopted kids. And a story that we hear that's a recurring story is adoptions are not cheap. Adoptions can be expensive. The adoption process can be expensive. But whatever money we have to fork over when we adopt, it's nothing compared to what Jesus paid for our adoption. Because when you talk about our adoption, Jesus would give himself in order for us to be forgiven, in order to bring us home. So just a couple verses after that adoption verse, Paul would say this in verse 7. He would say, now in him, in Jesus, we have, and there's a word here, it looks like a theological word. In him we have what? Redemption. Redemption just means to buy. It was an economics term. It was a commercial term. Paul is saying, listen, Jesus, he bought you. He bought you in order to bring you home. And here it's talking about the crucifixion, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. But then he tacks on this thing at the end, in accordance with read with me what's highlighted here, in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he dumped on us, that he lavished on us. Just not God's grace, but the riches of God's grace, the wealth of God's grace. Now, a conversation about the grace of God is a conversation about that aspect of God's character that is wildly generous. When we talk about God's grace, we're talking about that core part of God that just loves to give and give and give. It is my take that God did not create our world because he was lonely or bored, but because he desired to share himself with us. The world that we enjoy around us, the natural world, is an illustration, an example of the lavish generosity of God. A conversation about grace is a conversation about that aspect of God's character that is wildly generous, that is radically generous, that gives and gives and gives. And so that deal about God's grace, Paul is going to expand on that in chapter 2, but it's like he keeps throwing synonyms. It's like a gemstone that he keeps turning the generosity of God and seeing different facets of it. And so he throws words at it like love, like mercy, like grace. And so notice how these compound in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. But because of his we get an adjective here, because of his great love for us, God, and then he can't hold himself back, who is mercy rich, who is rich in mercy, made us alive even when we were dead in our transgressions. It is by grace that you have been rescued. And so here you have the great love of God, the mercy richness of God, the grace of God. All these are facets of that element of God that is wildly generous. But in this, buried in this, do not miss the condition from which we were rescued. It says God showed his love for us. God showed his mercy for us when we were, what word is it? When we were what? When we were dead. It's like we were running from God and we did not care. This is important. This is important. Because what this means is that the crucifixion of Jesus does not die to make good people better. Jesus doesn't even die to make bad people good. The self-giving of Jesus on the cross was so that spiritually dead people could be brought to life. It's about making dead people live. What we're talking about here is CPR of the soul, that God awakens, quickens, enlivens your spirit. Just understand that what we're talking about here is not how we somehow measure up. This is very God-centric. This is not about being self-righteous. This is about the gift that God gives: adoption, redemption, love, mercy, grace. And this grace thing, he continues riffing on this theme. You get to verse 8 of this. He says, it is by grace that you've been rescued. It is the what? It's the gift. This is the gift of God. And then he goes, just make sure we all understand, not by works so that no one will boast. When he says not by works so that no one will boast, he says, let's be really clear about something. You didn't earn this. You didn't. Grace by definition is something you did not deserve and do not earn. Did not deserve and cannot earn. And so he calls it is the what? It's the gift. It's the gift of God. I just need you to hear this and absorb this and chew on this. God does not love you because you're good. He loves you because he's good. God does not love you because you're good. He loves you because he's good. This is about the gift that he gives. And there are two types of people, at least two, but two types of people that really have difficulty getting this. One is people who have been very, very bad, and the other is people who have been very, very good. Often someone who says, no, Jeff, you don't understand. I've done something despicable, something disgusting, dumb. I'm simply too far from God's grace. And I would just say, no matter what you've done, you cannot be too far from God's grace. When Jesus was here, he would word it this way. He would say, the Son of Man came. He called himself the Son of Man sometimes. He said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save. Does anybody know how that ends? To seek and to save the lost. He said, that's how you qualify. If you are absolutely, desperately, you cannot know how far I have lost my way, Jesus says, aha, now we can talk. That's why he came. Ephesians chapter 2, it is by grace, not by works. Who do we believe authored that? Guy's called the Apostle Paul. When we open our Bibles and first see the Apostle Paul, he is not called the Apostle Paul. Anybody know his name? When we're first introduced to him, he's not called the Apostle Paul. He is known as Saul of Tarsus. The first time you're exposed to Saul of Tarsus, he is helping in the execution of a Christian leader in the city of Jerusalem. The guy's name is Stephen, and he is being stoned to death. And Saul of Tarsus is helping watch the coats of the people that are killing Stephen through stoning. That's where we find Saul. The person who wrote the words, it is by grace that we have been rescued. because of God's lavish mercy, because of the love that gets dumped on us, was written by a person that was at war with God. Paul would write to us, you cannot be too far from God's grace. Two different types of people have difficulty grasping this. One is the person who has been very, very bad. The other is the person that has been very, very good. This is mercy, grace, dead in your sins. Jeff, I simply wasn't that bad. See, some of you have been afflicted with a condition called early grace. It's when you're born on a Thursday and in the church nursery on a Sunday. Raised in a children's program, maybe even Christian school, maybe Christian camp. And you responded to Jesus in one way or another very, very early in life. And you say, just understand, dead in sins, I wasn't exactly a crack addict when I asked Jesus into my heart when I was a 7-year-old in a Sunday school class. I wasn't that bad. Some of us have difficulty absorbing grace because in our heart of hearts, we really don't believe that we need it. And in our condition, my dad was a preacher. I was in church from week one. This is the gift that God will often give us. God will often give us a glimpse into our depravity. He will give us a glimpse into our sinful potential. Those of you that experienced early grace and really in your heart of hearts go, I just really wasn't that bad. Every once in a while, it's like the cellar door of your heart will get opened and you look inside. This happens when you explode at your children and you are out of control and stepping back, you go, I don't know what else to call that, but that felt kind of demonic. Your gracious God has just lifted the cellar door and given you a glimpse into your depravity and say, listen, man, maybe the tree of evil had not fully grown and bloomed and borne ugly fruit, but you know what? The seeds were there. If nothing else, you get a glimpse into what you might have become without Christ. You just say something unfair, kind of nasty and derogatory about someone, and you step away from the conversation and you go, what possessed me to have to rip that person down? And those of you who do that and you experienced early grace, again, it's like God lifts the cellar door open and you peek inside. And again, you go, maybe the tree had not grown bearing all its ugly fruit, but I swear the seeds were there. Best case scenario is that in those moments we go, I need Jesus very, very badly. And I have sinned in 1,000 ways that grieve the Father's heart. Two types of people have a challenge absorbing the gift that Christ gave for them. Those who have been very bad, those who have been very good. But this is where the journey of generosity begins. You see, when we begin to show generosity in our lives, whether it's through our words, through hospitality, through giving money away, understand this is not a conversation that we are beginning, that we're starting. The conversation has already started because of the generosity of God for us, his mercy, his love, his forgiveness, his grace. You say, wow, man, those things are so cool. Is there anything that God had possibly want in return? Yes. Our gracious God desires to transform gift receivers into gift givers. There are dozens of aspects to generosity, dozens of avenues, dozens of forms of generosity. What I want to do is simply pinpoint 4 gifts that we give in response to the gift that we've received. And the reason I picked these 4 is because they all occur like in Ephesians chapter 4, right after this thing on the mercy gift that we have received and the generosity gift that we've received. So 4 different gifts that we receive. So turn the corner with me from the gift we received to what we call it here. We're just calling it the gifts we give, the gifts we give. So gift number 1, you ready? Really? All right, you asked for it. The gift of your resources. Gift number 1, the gift of your resources. And I talk about this first just because it occurs first in order in these that we're going to pull out of Ephesians chapter 4 and 5. Ephesians 4 verse 28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. That was written to church people. Does that surprise you? The Apostle Paul writes to the saints of Ephesus and says, if you have formerly made your living as a pickpocket and embezzling from your boss, cut it out. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. Yeah, I get it. Okay, that's the transforming work of God to take me from thief to unthief, from thief to former thief. No. The verse continues, but must work. Probably good to find a job. Doing something useful with their hands, other than stealing other people's stuff, that they may have what? 3 words highlighted. That they may have what? Something to share with those in need. Here is the miracle of the grace effect. Someone goes not from thief to unthief. Someone is transformed from thief to philanthropist. Now that's a miracle of God's hand. From someone that has spent their life taking to someone who now begins to orient their world around giving. The grace effect. Grace receivers become grace givers. One of the gifts is the gift of resources. And this may be a number of different forms. I mean, there's maybe the financial gifts you give to the church that is a blessing. You bless the church financially, that's a blessing to you. This might be to nonprofit organizations and mission agencies, individuals in need. This can be the individual who says, we want to upgrade our car and we got this old car. It's still pretty reliable. The joy we would have in giving it to someone without reliable transportation far exceeds our delight in getting the trade-in money. And you go, that thought could not have come from God. What if it does? What if gift receivers are to be transformed into gift givers? Now, this is not token generosity. It's a radical generosity where we begin to orient our finances around giving money and giving stuff away. But this can also be something very, very simple. It doesn't have to be an automobile. This can be showing up at school and someone forgot their lunch and you share half your sandwich. This is the work of God when we begin to share the gift of our resources. I have a little secret for you. There are individuals who are very disciplined at giving money away. There's generosity of finances, but they're not generous relationally. They give money away, but they're mean and unkind. You see, development, growth in one area of generosity doesn't guarantee growth in another area of generosity. So there's the gift of resources, gift 1. The second gift is just the gift of your words. The gift of your words. And this is the very next verse, I believe, in Ephesians 4, the gift of your words, where Paul writes, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. Stuff that's unkind, stuff that's untrue, stuff that's just wrong. Do not let any unwholesome tweets come out of your phone. Anybody guessing that there might be a second part to the verse here? But only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, so that it might benefit the people who have to hear me yap. That it might truly benefit the people, those who are listening to me talk. Now, this third little line here, according to their needs, it's very possible that our speech patterns are controlled by things that related to my needs. My need to be funny, even at somebody else's expense. My need to sound clever. My need to garner insider information. Well, you know what I heard. And the unparalleled, my need to be right. My need to be right. Most of the time, when you detect a accelerating conversation, when it's a conversation that kind of turns into a war, if you look back and retrace and do an autopsy on that argument, a lot of times it's, you're not listening. No, you're not hearing me, you're not listening. And I swear that much of the time you would detect that it was based on my need to be right rather than your need to be heard and understood. My friends, this is massive. In fact, Play along. Let's read this one out loud together. Okay, ready? But only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. The whole deal about building others up, there's a type of speech profile that rips people down, and there's a type of speech profile that consistently builds people up. Listen, those of you in hostile family environments and those of you in hostile work environments, I'm telling you, waking up each morning, saddling up and going off to work and just being able to say, listen, I am a builder, I am a builder, I am a builder, because there is so much destructive conversation that takes part. That's part of the old script. That's not part of the new script. That's part of the old story. That's not part of the new story. And as I receive God's gift, as I'm a recipient of the generosity of God, I desire to become a distribution outlet for his generosity when I go to work. I am a builder, I am a builder, I am a builder. It's generosity of words. Generosity of resources, generosity of words. Jeff, it is so easy to be generous with my words as long as everybody is behaving. It's when people misbehave that it's hard to be generous with our words. You with me on this? It's when people misbehave that it's hard to be generous with our words. Let's talk about that. Gift number 3, the gift of forgiveness. Ephesians 4, verse 32, the gift of forgiveness, Paul would write this: be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other upon what grounds? Just as in Christ, last 3 words with me, ready? God forgave you. See, this is generosity in and generosity out. It's forgiveness in and it's forgiveness out. The basis for cutting other people some slack when they say something thoughtless or harmful is the fact that God has forgiven me the thousands of things that were thoughtless and harmful. Jesus would echo, Paul is echoing something that Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer. If you grew up in a tradition where you said the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer, it's just that line, forgive us our debts, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive our debtors, as we forgive those who trespass against us. What Jesus is saying in that part of the Lord's Prayer is that gift receivers are to be transformed into gift givers. Now, just as we do a flyby of this thing on forgiveness, I know that it raises all kinds of issues with some of you, particularly if you have someone incredibly nasty, demeaning, or abusive in your life, and you go, I don't think I could ever trust that person again. Later in our series, we're going to be taking one entire message and talking about the gift of forgiveness. And just for now, there's a difference between forgiveness and trust. Forgiveness is given, trust is earned. Trust is a series of promises kept. You build trust. It's possible to forgive someone that you wouldn't trust with your money or with your kids. And so simply separating those two and saying, I need to forgive them for what they did, I don't think I would trust them, that's okay. And so we need to make some of those distinctions. Right now that's slated for message 8, unless I change the order. But the gift of forgiveness, it will cost you something. Generosity, always. It will heal something, but it will also cost you something. Forgive each other just as Christ forgave you. Forgive each other just as Christ forgave you. Forgive each other just as Christ forgave you. Sometimes we have a difficulty doing this because we haven't fully absorbed this. Strip away chapters 1 through 2 and 3, and all of these commands turn into do this, don't do that, do that. You go, that's what the Bible is, just a list of do's and don'ts. No. It's responding to the lavish generosity of God in a way that I begin to dump generosity in all its forms on those around me. It's the grace effect where grace receivers become grace givers. Okay, dude, this is getting heavy. You're talking the gift of my resources, the gift of my words, the gift of forgiveness. That's like That's like everything. You're right. Gift number 4, the gift of you. Let's just get down to it. This is giving you the gift of yourself. Now, chapters 5, verse 1 and 2, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly what? We're right back to adoption. He picked you out. He picked you up. He brought you home. Your most defining moment in life isn't the person who dumped you or rejected you or betrayed you. It's the God who adopted you. He reminds them who they are. As dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. See, because that's what love does. Love gives. He loved us and gave himself for us. The self-giving of Christ. Love gives. One of the first verses a little kid can learn in a children's program in a church is a verse that goes like this: for God so loved the world that he gave, because he gave his only son, because that's what love does. Love gives. So realize something, absorb something, and it's this, that when you give your time, when you lovingly give your time, you're really giving you. Some of you with small children in the home, and it is exhausting and it is tiring, and you give and give and give. You get them up and you get them fed, and you put them to bed at night, and you maybe on one time or another give them some correction. But it's giving, but as you give your time, you're giving you. You're giving yourself. Those of you that are finding so many beautiful ways to give to your community and love your community well. We have individuals in this congregation that help recently released inmates transition back into society. And it's time consuming as you mentor, but as you give your time, you're giving you. Those of you that will carve out time in your week to assist in an after-school reading program so that kids that are falling farther and farther and farther behind have an opportunity with a one-on-one mentor, not a class where there's one teacher and 28 kids, but a one-on-one conversation to help a child in their reading. You're saying it's time-consuming. I go there every Wednesday afternoon. As you give your time, what you're really giving, you're giving you. You're giving yourself. Those of you that have made it a priority to visit a nursing home over and over and over and over, and some of the people that you visit and love on do not remember that you were there when you drive away, and you've made this part of your schedule and you give your time, but when you give your time, you're giving you. And the hundreds of you that serve in your church as small group directors, as small group hosts, as small group leaders, those of you that love and lead our teenagers and middle schoolers, our children, who clean up between services, who help people find a seat on those really full Sundays, those of you who help greet people when they walk in or make coffee and set out cookies. It's a time commitment, but what you're giving is yourself, and it makes perfect sense that a follower of Jesus would live in that way, because it's the grace effect. Those who receive God's generosity should become specialists at distributing God's generosity. Gift receivers, we are to be transformed into gift givers. People living in Ephesus in the first century needed to be reminded of the gift they received, and they also needed a reminder of the gifts that they were supposed to give. I get the sense that neither of these were automatic. We can come to Jesus in a moment of need and forget his mercy and grace and love and forgiveness really fast. We need to be reminded of the price he paid to bring us home. We can forget the gift we receive, and then we can forget the gifts, the generosity that's supposed to flow out of our lives. Paul, apparently it was normal and natural to have to remind Christians of the gifts that come in and the gifts that need to go out because we forget. And so my hope is that these 8 weeks on Grace Effect is just an 8-week reminder of receiving God's grace and giving God's grace. It's the Grace Effect. The city, Erie, Pennsylvania, ring a bell. Have any of you heard this in the news? Christmas weekend. Okay, back to my weatherman moment, which is awesome. Erie, Pennsylvania is right over here. Notice that it is on a lake and they experienced just a bit of lake effect snow over Christmas weekend. Would you like a picture? Wonderful. Here you go. That's a car. And that's a car. And that's a car. They received over 60 inches of snow in 48 hours. Let me do the math for you. That's over 5 feet of snow in 2 days. What that means is if you take a shovel and shovel your sidewalk, it might end up looking like this. That's what 5 feet of snow in 2 days, that's what it does. And there's this next image here is just his house and just all the shrubbery is just absolutely covered with a mountain of snow. I want so much for that to be us. What if the breeze of God's generosity rushes in and through and around this congregation and unlocks and unleashes a spirit of generosity like we've never known it before? What if there are people that exit this 8-week study, this 8-week conversation, and they go, I forgave somebody that I should have forgiven 5 years ago, and I've been grudging out on them and embittering myself, and it was just time. And I received the grace to offer the gift of forgiveness to them. That's going to happen during this series. There are people during this series by the hundreds who will take a massive step forward in walking away from a culture of materialism, and they will leave behind token generosity, and they will begin to discover what radical generosity is all about, ordering our finances around giving money away, and it will be a life changer and it will be a game changer for you. I believe that there will be families, middle school kids and high schoolers and their parents, in the way they relate and the way they respond. And when we talk about generous relationship and the gift of our words, not immediately, but over time, this can transform homes. And I believe that there will be those of us who, if the truth were known, have lived in a fairly self-absorbed way. And we will come to grips with the fact, we will say, to give my time is to give me, to give my life. And Jesus deserves all of me. Some of you will find yourselves serving strangers that you barely know. And God stirs up this brand new impulse. This is what the grace effect does. We receive a gift and we give gifts. And today, at the end of our conversation with week 1, if there's one impression that I would love for you to have and leave with, it's just that you are deeply, deeply loved by God. I too want to begin not asking you to do anything, but just reminding you how much the Father loves you and the extent he went to bring you home, to get you back, and to have your heart. I would like you to leave with an overwhelming impression that if you've come to know the saving power of Jesus, that your most defining moment isn't the person that abandoned you, it's the God who took you in. That you are his treasured kid. And as you absorb that, as you reflect on that, let that change you and be the inspiration and the motivation and the empowering to love and serve the flawed people that you interact with day after day. Let me ask you to stand. I'll close in prayer today. And I would just love for us to be able to exit week 1. If you're comfortable doing this, sometimes I just open my hands and hold them out like this in front. I say, gracious God, here we are with open hands. Speak to us, mold us, shape us, transform us. We need it. We come with open hands to receive a fresh infusion of your grace for us. And we stand with open hands, giving you permission to work in any area of our lives in which you would be pleased to move. So here we are. We offer ourselves to you in the name of Jesus, who came and gave himself for us. Amen. We'll see you next week.